Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a pastel landscape. I'm going to be using pastel pencils on a UART 800 sanded paper. So let's start. The first thing I'm going to do is divide the paper or divide the scene roughly into two parts of more or less the same size. That's going to be the line of the water, which will be separating the objects above the water and the reflected images in the water. I'm also going to sketch out the outline of the trees in the back on the other side of the river, just to give myself an idea about where I'm going to draw the sky. Now for the sky, I'm going to start with a white pastel pencil. It's barely visible now that I put it down, but I want to put it down first because I want the sky to end up being lighter. I'm going to put some blue on top of that, but I want to achieve a very dull light blue color. And that's why I put the white down first. Now I'm putting a little bit of this light ultramarine, and once I blend that with a layer of white underneath, I should end up with the color that I was going for. So I'm working on a pastel paper, sanded paper, UART 800, which is the finer grit, the finest grit they have. And as you can see, it blends very easily. Blending pastel pencils is much easier than colored pencils, even though this paper works with colored pencils as well, and other media. Now, the sky is mostly done. I'm going to move on with the trees, and first I'm going to put down some greenish colors. I'm going to use this light yellowish green, which is a very bright color, but that's okay because I'm going to be mixing it with some black, and I'm going to be drawing some texture and some shadow areas on top of that. The size of the paper, by the way, is around 9 times 12 inches or so. So first I want to establish that lighter green base color, which will come in handy later because once I start covering it with darker colors, I want some of those brighter details to show through. I'm not going to be covering all of it. So first I put down the brighter green color, which is a slightly yellowish green, as you can tell, and then I did a bit of blending with my finger. So now I'm going to work on the foliage. In front of the trees there will be some bushes, but these are the bush here on the left is already a part of the midground, so it's popping into the scene from the left. I'm going to get to that a bit later, or much later in the scene. Right now I'm going to focus on these trees in the background. How am I going to draw these? Well, when you just make small circular motions with a pencil, you will get a combination of lighter and darker marks, lighter and darker details. So my goal is not to cover everything. My goal is to produce a bit of a texture that kind of looks like foliage as seen from a distance. This is a trick, a simple trick that I've used in many of my videos where I draw trees or foliage. And it works pretty well because it's a very simple technique, but the effect is pretty good because you end up with something that looks like foliage. Now to make things a little bit more complicated for me here, the tree tops are catching a little bit of light at the top, so I can't really define the shapes only by working from light to dark. I also have to go back in and work from dark to light. The good thing about that is that this surface allows me to put some lighter details or lighter layers on top of the darker ones. But there are limitations to that with pastels, because with colored pencils I feel like this would be a little bit easier. With pastels, because they are softer, there is more residue on the paper and there is more muddying of colors. This is especially the case because this is a fine grit. If I were working on a lower grit paper, maybe it would be easier for me to produce that rough looking texture that I could use to imitate the appearance of foliage. Here it will be a little bit more difficult, so there are both advantages and disadvantages to using a finer tooth paper. Now that I've worked with pastels on this fine 800 grit sanded paper, I would say that with pastels, if you're using UART, you might want to go with a slightly lower grit, like 600 or 400. I'm not really sure, but it might be a good idea. With colored pencils, I would say the finer the better. I also added a touch of blue to some of the shadow areas because I didn't want them to look simply black or dull. I wanted to add a little bit of color to them. And as you can see, every now and then I'm going back in and adding some lighter details with a green pencil. There's another limitation to that. These pencils, because they are softer, they pick up a little bit of that dust from underneath and they get dirty very quickly, which means that you have to either resharpen them or clean them every now and then if you want to get clean marks. Now on the other hand, the best way to blend pastel pencils is probably to layer lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. That way you can soften the marks and you can blend colors very nicely that way. It works a lot better than pretty much any blending tool. I mean, when it comes to blending two different colors. So sometimes when I feel like I have too much texture or I want to soften some of the marks, some of those ugly lines and things like that, I will just drag my pencil and allow it to pick up both the light and the dark color, making for a slightly blurrier image. Because after all, many of these trees are a part of the background, so they're further back, and the stuff that is further back in the scene can't be too well defined in terms of detail and texture. So it's sometimes, or it's usually a good idea to soften it a little bit by blending. And pretty much the only way that I used to blend these two colors together, because I mostly used green and black, was to use the lighter green on top of the black, muddying the color a little bit and then softening the texture. And then if I felt like I needed some more texture or a little bit more darker color in some places to define the separate shapes, to define individual shapes, I would just go back in, add darker color, add a little bit of texture, add a little bit of shadowing between the trees, or if I wanted some of the lighter parts of those canopies, the tops of the trees to stand out, I would just clean up my lighter pencil and draw the top of the tree so that that would stand out. So it's a back and forth process. It's a little bit difficult to explain for somebody who hasn't really experienced working with pastel pencils. There's only so much I can explain with just using words. Sometimes you just have to use the tools yourself. You have to feel how they work, how they feel against the paper that you're using, and then you will adapt and you will learn some of the tricks that are very difficult to explain. Also, because these videos that I put on YouTube are a little bit shorter, so some of it is in real time, some of it is in time lapse. There's only so much I can convey in this somewhat shorter time format, because I have to narrate the whole drawing process and kind of compress it into only half an hour. If you want to see longer videos, if you want to see what the real-time process looks like, and if you want to see much longer or hear much longer explanations and longer narration, you should check out my Patreon, because on Patreon I have hundreds of real-time or full-length narrated videos where you can really observe the process and maybe even draw along with me. But like I said, nothing can really substitute practice. You just have to practice, and whichever tool you're using, whether it's pastel pencils or colored pencils, you have to feel how they work against this particular or on this particular surface. UART sanded paper is a pleasure to work with. both with pastel pencils and colored pencils, and I would say that it is especially good with pastel pencils because it's relatively quick to work with. You can cover large areas quickly, but as you can see, when it comes to these smaller, finer details here, it can take a little bit of time and patience. So I'm working on this group of taller trees in the middle. These are obviously quite a bit taller, but also closer to our viewpoint, which is why they appear larger. And for the most part, the tree is going to be darker here, especially at the bottom, but some parts of it are going to be lighter. Now, notice that I'm going back and forth with my light and dark pencil, but when I start blending with a lighter pencil, when I start muddying the colors as it were, notice that I don't blend all of those lighter areas. I want some of those brightest bits to stand out. I simply don't cover them either with a black pencil or with blending. During the blending process, I leave those untouched so that they stick out and so that they feel like some parts of the canopy which are protruding and catching more light from the light source. A lot of it here on the right and in the middle and at the bottom is in the shadow, and I even made a few lines to make some indications of some of the larger boughs and branches which are maybe visible through the canopy, through the foliage. I made a few adjustments on the sky, maybe added a few lighter details, and then I started moving on to from the left and the middle part of the scene onto the right side of the scene because I still have a lot more trees to do. So this was a lengthy drawing process. Pastel pencils, like I said, are faster to work with than colored pencils, especially when you need to cover large areas. But when you want to produce these smaller, finer details, and when you want a nice texture that looks like foliage, that takes a little bit of patience. I mean, I could cover this a little bit more quickly, but then it would look a bit ugly. I want to create a texture that looks like foliage, but at the same time I want to break up these larger shapes into smaller shapes so that it doesn't just look like a bunch of dark green shapes, so that the viewer can make sense out of that foliage, and so that it looks like there are smaller shapes of trees and bushes in there. I'm not merely dividing this large group of trees into separate or individual trees, but I'm also dividing the trees themselves into clusters of foliage which form around the larger boughs and branches. So the whole purpose of this is making creating that illusion of depth and complexity so that the viewer can feel like they're looking at actual trees. But this is a simplified process at the same time because I'm not trying to draw every single leaf. I'm not trying to draw every single branch or anything like that. I'm merely allowing the pencil to work for me by producing a texture that looks like foliage, but at the same time, in some places, as you can see, I simply stick around a little bit more with that black pencil, creating those shadow areas. Then I go back in with a green pencil, softening the texture in some places and creating a sort of a dark green, duller green color. But at the same time leaving some of the lighter areas here and there where I feel like the canopies of the trees would be catching a little bit more light, and then adding some final details with that clean light pencil. And to keep things simple, I simply chose to work with two pencils, the black pastel pencil and that light green pastel pencil. I think the results were pretty good considering the fact that I'm only using two pencils. Here and there I added a touch of some other green and also a touch of blue, but for the most part I used these two, and as you can see, you can create some pretty nice looking foliage with some very nice colors, very convincing looking colors that look natural. So I always like to keep it simple, first because you know, it's a good idea to keep it simple when you have to produce lots of videos and lots of drawings every month. But also because, I don't know, I'm not really an expert on colors. For the most part, during my drawing career, I worked in charcoal and graphite, mostly in black and white technique. So when it comes to colors, I like to make things a little bit simpler and a little bit easier for me. As you can tell, again, we have some more of that shadow at the bottom, especially and also between the separate trees, separate bushes, whatever they are. Some of these round shapes at the bottom, I don't really know whether they are lower or smaller trees or larger bushes. It doesn't really matter. I'm still going to draw their shape as best as I can. Now, as for the reference is going to be in the description. But if you're looking at the reference, don't be surprised if some of the trees and some of the shapes are a little bit different than in the reference. I'm just trying to capture the general idea. I'm not really going to get hung up on every single tiny bush or every cluster of foliage. I don't really care that much about details or precision. I want to capture the general idea because I like the scene. I like this green riverscape with those beautiful reflections. So that's what we're going to try to do. The foliage doesn't have to be exactly the same as long as it looks convincing. So I'm pretty much finishing the trees in the top part of the scene. Just a few more trees or bushes here, just using the same approach. First we have the green as the base color, then a little bit of black to indicate the shadow areas and add some textures, then a little bit of blending with the green again to create a dark green color, and then a few final touches with the clean light green pencil. And now, as you can see, the top part of the scene is pretty much done, and I'm moving on to the midground area. And in the midground area, as you can see, we're gonna have a little bit of grass and some more bushes. A bush that is here on the left, which is partly in front of the trees there, and the riverbank, I'm going to have to do that as well, the riverbank on the other side. But once I start getting into that, I'm really going to have to start working on the reflections. So the tricky thing here is defining where the tree line ends and that grassy riverbank begins, and also where the grassy riverbank ends and the surface of the water and the reflections begin. This will be a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to achieve that by making the reflections a little bit darker and a little bit blurrier, because the reflections in the water do appear a bit blurrier because of the movement of the water for the most part, I would think. And that's why I'm going to be adding a little bit more detail and a little bit more texture on the grassy area above the water. And the trees here also have to be reflected, and that's the shadow area, or that bottom portion of the trees, which is going to be darker, which is good for me because it's going to allow me to create contrast with this small part of the riverbank which is protruding into the scene on the left, and with this bush on the left as well, which is a lot lighter than both the trees in the background and that reflected image in the water on the right. Now I'm adding a little bit of texture to that bush, but notice that here I'm making slightly larger marks. I'm making larger circular motions, and I'm going to do the same thing with a lighter pencil as well, because here I'm trying to produce an illusion of larger foliage. So when you're drawing the foliage, which is way back in the distance, you want to produce a finer texture that looks like a combination of very tiny lighter and darker shapes. When you're drawing the foliage that is closer to a viewpoint, you're going to have to find a way to produce a texture that looks a little bit larger, that looks like larger leaves, larger clusters of leaves, because they're closer to a viewpoint and they're going to appear larger to us. There's also some more shadow here at the bottom, and also in the middle of the bush. Also there are some shadow areas where maybe the light is not reaching through, and some of the lighter parts are sticking out, and those are lighter. Just finishing this part of the riverbank, defining that shadow area between the riverbank and the trees. And now I'm going to do a little bit of work on the water here. I'm going to use a similar approach where I'm going to put down the white pastel pencil first, because the reflected image of the sky, the reflected sky in the water, needs to be lighter as well. But I'm going to make it a little bit darker. The reflected images in the water are going to appear a little bit darker overall. So I'm going to put down a little bit less of the white pastel, and maybe a little bit more of this light ultramarine pastel. And then once I blend these two, I will end up with a slightly darker color than the sky, which is what I was going for. And the same thing is going to be the case with the reflections of the trees and the bushes, because I want those to appear a little bit larger. Now, during the blending process, here and there, my fingers picked up a little bit of that darker color here and there, and that got mixed into the light blue, which is okay. I ended up with a grayish light blue color, which is also very nice. So sometimes these happy accidents happen. If I picked up a little bit more of that black pastel dust, things would have gotten very ugly, but luckily that didn't happen. I picked up just a little bit. I ended up with a bluish gray dull color, which I think looks really good with this sea. So now I'm doing a little bit more work on these reflections, and the thing about reflections is not to worry too much about the exact shapes of the trees, because the shapes are going to be distorted anyway in the surface of the water. The reflections of the images are going to be distorting those objects. So you want to do a little bit more blending, a little bit more muddying with your finger. And the thing that you want to try to get right is position the lighter areas and the darker areas so that they look more or less symmetrical, so that the reflection and the images above the water look more or less symmetrical in terms of the position of the areas of lighter and darker value. So what you're trying to do is you don't want to match the exact details, the exact shapes, you want to match the values. So if we have a lighter bush in one part of the scene, you want to make the reflection in that part a little bit lighter. There's another bush here growing by the water all the way on the left at the bottom, and you can see how I made the foliage look even larger, because this one is even closer to our viewpoint. And then there is a little bit of grass here growing out of the water. So I'm just going to draw some thin lines to represent that grass, but the grass also needs to be reflected in the water, which is a little bit tricky. And another thing that's a little bit tricky with these lines is that I first have to draw, because I don't have a dark green, I first have to pull the black and then put a little bit of green on top of it, and that way I end up with something that kind of looks like a combination of a bunch of dark green lines. I added a few ripples here to make the thing a little bit more convincing, so that it looks like actual water. And I'm going to do the same thing around this little island of grass to the left. So now I'm really gonna have to start doing more work on the reflections, where I'm gonna try to match several things. So like I said, the first and the most important thing is to try to match the values of the objects above the water. Don't worry about exact shapes. You're not going to have clean shapes in the reflection. They're all going to be distorted and blurry. So focus instead on the values. And another thing is roughly the size of the reflection. So I'm going to try to match, if there are taller trees above the water, the reflection is going to have to appear longer there as well. I added a little bit more grass on this part of the bank, which is sticking out on the left. And now I'm going to draw the reflection of this large group of trees in the middle and on the right. This part of the drawing process will be a little bit quicker because I don't really have to work that much to produce that texture or foliage. But at the same time, it will be a little bit more challenging because I'm going to have to try to get the reflection to look right. So let's see how that's going to go. Also, there are some of these ripples in the water. The image is broken into these smaller ripples, and you want to capture that as well because the image is interrupted by lighter shapes of the water and the smaller, darker shapes into which the reflected image is broken into. So now I'm putting down some black on top of the green to make the reflected image or the reflected objects darker. I'm going to do some blending with my finger because here I don't want as much texture. I'm going to be using both the side to side and up and down motion, where I first do a little bit of blending, going back and forth, and then I pull down. I go back and forth and I pull down, creating something that looks like reflected images in the water. It's really not that complicated, as you can see, with just a few light motions of the finger and a little bit of blending. You can create something that looks like fairly convincing reflections, but the reflection is still far from perfect because, as you can see, there are many shapes above the water which need to be reflected a bit more accurately in the surface of the water, and to do that I'm starting to put in some suggestions of darker areas which will match the darker areas above the water. So on this tall tree there are some large shadow areas, so I put those in. So now you can see the image, the reflected image, is starting to look a bit more like the tree above the water. Similarly, some of the lighter trees and bushes, they are catching a lot of light on the upper part of their canopies. I have to put those in as well so that they would match with the images above the water. Every now and then I will pull with my brush to smear the image a little bit so that it looks more like a reflection in the water. And now, as you can see, I'm just going back and forth, putting in a little bit of darker value in those areas of the reflection which need to be darker, or a little bit of lighter value in those areas where some of the lighter bushes or the lighter portions of the bushes are being reflected. So I'm going to be going like that back and forth until I'm happy with the reflection. And one trick that I've used, which will make it a little bit easier for you to draw a better looking reflection, is to turn the drawing vertically, and that way you can kind of look at the reflections from a different angle, and maybe that way is a little bit easier to see whether you need a little bit of darker value in some places and a little bit of lighter value in others, so that the reflection and and the images above and the objects above the water match a little bit better. It doesn't have to be perfect, so don't worry about it. The viewers are not really going to be measuring exactly whether the objects above the water and the reflected images match, and after all, the images or the reflections will be distorted because of the movement of the water, so it's not a big deal. I also realized at one point that some of those reflections were a little bit too short, so I kept adding a little bit more to them to make them a little bit longer, and I kept adding a little bit of those small interrupted shapes to make the ripples in the water look more convincing. There are also a couple of nice looking white birds here above the surface of the water. I also thought that was a nice detail which I wanted to include, so I'm going to draw a bird here on the right, a larger one which is closer to our viewpoint, and then there's another bird a little bit further away, and there's also a little bit of a reflection and maybe a few lighter details, lighter objects on the opposite bank. Maybe those are some kind of birds as well. It doesn't really matter, but I think those birds were a nice touch. Just going to do a little bit of work to add some darker values in some parts of the reflection, and do a little bit of refining. So as you can see, the reflections also took a little bit of work, even though I was hoping that they would be a little bit quicker and a little bit simpler. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner. And now, as you can see, the drawing is pretty much done. I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and once again, for more content, you want to check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching once again, and bye for now.